The skeletal and animation system inside of Unreal is really information rich. And so what this lecture is going to do is it's going to start to chunk pieces of information into knowledge frameworks so that you can go back and have a context to build information onto those, should you care to. So how are we going to do that? We're going to talk about key terminology, and there's also a vocabulary section. Also, I'm going to review what tools and some of the key workflows that exist. And then also we'll talk a little bit about what technology is in flux. So specifically, we're going to be taking a look at ways of affecting and changing animations, bones and naming for animation, and methods for connecting multiple animations, as well as how this section connects to other areas of Unreal. When you start doing the tutorial in the project, start thinking about these frameworks and connecting it in your brain. So first of all, let's talk about terms and tools for the skeletal mesh animation system. Now you can start out with a single animation, and in Unreal that is known as an animation sequence. So we're going to drop that in. We already did that with the robotic arm. The next is there's a bunch of tools for combining animations. There's animation composite, montage, pose assets, and state machines. And all of these are used in different ways to either take multiple animations and combine it into a new usable animation, or to blend between multiple animations, or to use different poses in order to transition into an animated asset, or to take something that can have different use cases based on what the player may be doing, as in the case of state machines. So I put in links for all of those. There's also ways of reusing and modifying animations. Some of those can be used in the combining animations above, but that there's also, as we saw in the content examples, there was examples in there of animation retargeting, where animation that was on a certain set of skeletal systems was then retargeted and put on a different skeleton system. And that's done a lot in video games and in film. There's other tools as well for modifying animations for specific use cases. Aim offset is one of those, where it's a tool that's specifically used for third-person characters that are holding a gun, and you can just modify how their barrel is aiming at different players. And the opposite of aim offset would kind of be blueprints, in that aim offset is a very specific use case scenario, whereas blueprints can just be used for anything from diagnosing what the rotation point of a specific bone is and causing a certain thing to happen based on that, whether it's animation or morphs or visual effects. But they can also be used for adding in secondary motion as well. So blueprints are super, super flexible in terms of a tool. All right, I wanted to mention another context for learning Unreal skeletal mesh and animations is the animation editors that are built in. Now we've got the skeletal editor, and we've already showed some of these in context in the previous example. There's the skeletal mesh editor, where you can take and modify, and we're going to be going in one of the next lessons where we're going to be adding a socket to different animations for snapping different assets and tools to that socket area. There's also the animation area, and each of these different areas have different tools applied and used inside of them. So contrasting these with the workflows as you start to learn them will really help to build a knowledge network inside your brain. Then there's the Anim Blueprint Editor, and we talked just a lot about how different blueprints can be so flexible for being able to create different types of effects and controls. And then there's also the Physics Asset Editor, because the animation component is not all keyframed. We're going to talk a bit about that in the next slide. So movement within the skeletal mesh animation system. Now there are different types of skeletal movement. As you may have already known, or if you're just getting up to speed with animation, there's bone-driven skeletal animation that's self-defined, essentially, that animation is caused within a skeletal mesh by the bones, or it's tied to the bones. But within that, there's also vertex animations driven by morphs, and we're going to do some morph examples later in this chapter. Then there's also the ability to blend in simulation, and that's what I was talking about with the physics asset editor. Quite often, the physics properties are blended with typical animation. So if a character gets hit by a bullet or something, sometimes you can use the speed of that bullet to jostle the character or make them fall down. If they're dead, they can completely turn into a rag doll. So there's a lot of different blended versions, right? And there's also specific tools for blending between different states. So there's a pose asset or a curve-driven method for taking characters in certain states. And there's even ways of taking snapshots of current states where if a character fell down, then taking a snapshot of that and then blending it as they get up. There's physics blends, as I mentioned before, where you can blend either all or part of the skeleton and have a physics animation tied into that at different levels. And then finally, there's also bone plus vertex based animation. And in the previous section, I mentioned things like corrective blend shapes, where as a bone moves, the mesh underlying is transformed in order to create a correct shape. A good example of this would be as a character bends their arm, the bicep might flex a little bit, but also another corrective blend shape would be making sure that the elbow stays consistently sculpted out correctly. Finally, there's ways of adding control rigs on top of existing animation. And this is done a lot with motion capture files, where a motion capture sequence can be done and then a control rig can be put on top of that and used to modify or retarget existing animations in different ways to make them useful for different scenarios. Okay, as we wrap up this lesson, I wanted to say pay attention in the next several lessons to specific useful workflows. Some of them that we're going to aim for are ways of affecting and changing animations, and some of them are just really easy and accessible. You can modify the speed of an existing animation with blueprints. You can also blend with physics. And also, in earlier lessons, we've talked about using traces for identifying things, but traces can also be used on characters' feet. So that would be more intermediate or advanced, but something to keep your eye out for. Bones and names for animation are critical, especially when it comes to naming and retargeting. And we're also going to do an example with a really basic control rig and animation. And then finally, we're also going to talk about methods for connecting animations, because that's a key stepping stone for easing yourself into things like state machines or montages. And we're not going to get too advanced. The final lesson for this chapter is going to be giving an overview of the character workflow, where some of these tools that I've mentioned would come into context. But going over the whole animation workflow is multiple hours of learning, and it's a separate class itself. So I want to build a framework for you to build on so that if you do go in that direction, then you can rapidly jump into building knowledge bases for characters inside of Unreal. So state machines and blueprints, as I mentioned, and also designing loops. You can connect two animations with certain ways of blending those, but also in terms of having animation sequences themselves, like one animation go in a loop. And then as that loop completes, you can have a blueprint or some other state machine move right on to the next loop. As well as there's interrupts and types of blending, which we talked about. And finally, we're going to talk about how a lot of these different animation components inside of skeletal meshes and animation connect to other areas of Unreal. One of those specifically is that we're going to talk about blueprints, physics, and Anim Notifies. The Anim Notify, we are going to demonstrate audio-driven Anim Notifies by using a third-person example. And then also later in the VFX chapter, we're going to talk about particle-driven notifies. So these are just specific times in a character's animation that you can set up a point that talks to other blueprints. So we're going to do an audio-driven notify so that the character will make footstep sounds. And you can do other particle-driven notifies for example, if the character was doing a certain movement and you wanted to have a visual effect, or you could even have something like, as on the footsteps example, you could have like puffs of smoke coming out. This has been a very broad-stroked overview, but with a lot of different chunked down knowledge frameworks that hopefully will serve as a springboard for you to move further in this area. Let's wrap this up and we'll move on to some visual demonstrations.